Well, good morning, everybody. Am I on? There we go. All right. Good morning. Well, my name's Sam Boone, and I'm one of the pastors here. I'm the family pastor, and thank you guys for showing up for our class today. We're talking about parenting, and this is for our high school parents: parenting, curriculum, development, and then biblically, how do we lead and guide our kids through these years. So. Um, Today we are going to. I'm going to do a quick intro, kind of open. How many of you guys, real quick? How many of you guys, your kids are already in? They're in class, in school. Anyone's kids like not in school? Okay, I was going to call the police if your kids aren't at school yet. You guys been in for like a month already, kind of going full swing. Everyone's going? Cool. Yeah. Well, high school, it can be one of the most challenging and it can be one of the most joyful times of parenting. I have my two oldest girls. I have three kids. My two oldest girls are a junior in college and then a freshman in college. So we've kind of just come through high school. And high school can be a difficult season. It can be a wonderful season. And so my hope today is that you guys leave feeling encouraged, you leave feeling supported, you leave feeling that you have some resources in how to lead and guide your kids through this high school age. So let me pray for us, and then we've got a few things, and then I'm going to hand it off to Kyle. So let's pray. God, thanks so much. Thanks that we can be here. Thanks for your faithfulness to us. I thank you for each of our kids, God. I thank you for those, the season that they're in, the growing time they're in. I pray for our parents, God, as they navigate this high school season, that you would be with them, you would lead them, you would guide them, you would give them wisdom in how to best love and lead and train their kids. We pray this all in your mighty, wonderful name, Jesus. Amen. So everyone should have one of these booklets. It looks kind of like this. If you don't, you can put your hand up and someone will get it to you. This is also digital. So in the very front page, there's a QR code. If you scan that, it's online. That will actually take you to our entire parent page. We've got all of our classes from first and second grade all the way through high school on there, the recordings, and also all the resources. So this is, just so you know, it's a lot of information. It can kind of feel like drinking out of the fire hose. And so my intent is not that you feel overwhelmed, but that you can maybe even pick, hey, here's one or two or three things that I really want to focus on, because we're going to give you a lot of info, but each page has resources. And these are places for you to, if you go on the digital, you can just click on it and follow those links, and it's a great way to kind of find out a little bit more, have some resources, have some education. Second thing we've got for you is one of these, depending on what grade your child's in. And this is just a great take-home resource, kind of lets you know where your kid's at this year, and just a great reminder. So we also, in your seat, in your row, there should be a couple of these. It's a Q&A. Hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A. If not, you can come talk to one of us afterwards. So that is that. So let me just start with this, talking about how do we approach our teachers, how do we approach administration as parents, how do we handle that? The first thing I would just say is this, is get to know your child's teacher. I know in high school you're going to have maybe 5, 6, 7 different teachers, but maybe you can't get to know all of them, but get to know at least one of them. Get to know your kids' teachers. Maybe it's a coach, maybe it's a band teacher, maybe it's just one of their teachers where they love that classroom. Get to know that teacher, encourage them. Maybe it's even sending them a note, let them know, thank you for investing in my kid. As a teacher, teachers don't get celebrated a lot. I don't know if there's any teachers here. A couple, right? Teachers don't get celebrated often. It's very rare that you have someone, a student or even a parent, oh, thank you so much for all you do. And so that goes a long, long way, investing and just communicating to a teacher. We all know that school districts are great because the parents are invested, right? It's a good school district mainly because you have parents who are involved, who are focused, who are there, or supporting their kids, and on the opposite end, usually school districts struggle because you don't have parents who are involved. And so just being involved, encouraging, getting to know your teacher, that's a great way to start. Sometimes things come up where there is some conflict, where there's a problem, where there's something that you need to talk to the school about, you need to talk to the teacher about, you need to talk to the administration about. That kind of stuff comes up. And it is so much easier to have a conversation when you already have a relationship, when you're a known quantity. And so when things do come up, if there's conflict, maybe you feel like your kid's getting treated unfairly, maybe there's some content in the class that you just don't agree with, or you have some concerns, want to talk a little about how do we approach teachers. And the thing is this, is we need to remember that we represent Christ. As believers, we represent Jesus. When we go to talk to a teacher, when you go to talk to administration, remember, you're still a believer in Jesus Christ. You represent the Grove, you represent the Lord. And so that's important. The way that we have those conversations is important. And we need to have those conversations sometimes. But let me just say a couple thoughts. Like if you're really, really angry and you're about to write an email, it's probably a good idea to hold off. Like hold off, talk to a friend, talk to your spouse, kind of process through that. Because if you're just so angry, that's going to come out in the email, and you're going to write the wrong thing, right? We all know that. When you go to have an in-person conversation, James tells us be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. Actually ask good questions. Ask your teacher, like, hey, what's going on? Why, I have these concerns, and actually listen to what they say rather than just like blow up on them. We all have been on the receiving end of someone blowing up on us, and it just doesn't go well. So be gracious, be patient, ask good questions, find out, and then ultimately try to find a way that you and the teacher and the administration can support your child and do the best thing for them. So definitely there's a time to have those conversations. Definitely there's a time to engage. But when you do, make sure that you do it in a gracious, God-loving way and God-honoring way. And then the last thing is this, is just get involved with the school district. Get involved in local education. If you really have concerns about the direction the school district is going, you can go to any of the board meetings. In fact, right there below is some resources. And it's not just for RUSD, but it's kind of all of our local schools. Here's the website for their school boards. They're open to everyone. You can go in person. You can go online. If you have a concern, you can voice it there. You can be represented. And so if you have a concern, don't just wait until it comes out in the classroom. Say, well, I'm going to go to this meeting. I'm going to voice my concern. I'm going to share what I think, or I'm going to go and listen, kind of hear what are they talking about. So that's a great way to be involved. So check those things out. Those are some great resources. I'm going to introduce, so we're going to talk about curriculum, what is kind of going on in the high school curriculum. I know we're doing 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. This is a lot of stuff all at once. But Kyle Perry's going to come up and share that. Then we're going to hear about development, kind of what's going on in your kid developmentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, what's going on in their life. And then last, we're going to talk about biblically, how do we lead our kids. So let me hand it over to Mr. Kyle Perry.
So, first of all, a little background about me. I am in my 7th year teaching at Orange Vista High School out in Val Verde Unified in Paris. I also have done the high school ministry here at this church the last 8 years. And so this is my age group. I love, that high school age when they start to figure out, like, what do I want to do in life? What do I want to be? And really get that kind of personal or self-identity. So I genuinely love this age group and love, the potential and the mentorship and the leadership that comes with that. So with that, if you guys want to follow along on the second page there with the curriculum, I worked with an awesome team of other teachers, make up of different districts, which you'll hear from some of them later, but covering all the different districts that we can in the area. And then first, so we have our main subjects, our core subjects, English, science, social studies / history, and those are kind of the main ones, because obviously math, that goes without saying, not really anything controversial there. It's numbers. It hasn't really changed a lot. So we looked at English first. We talked with one of our Riverside Unified English teachers, and we talked about, how do you go about selecting your books? Because sometimes the books can be controversial, depending on what they select. And we talked with them, and they guaranteed that this year at least there isn't anything that could come up as controversial. A lot of it is older literature, things that are just, known as like the greats, Gatsby, things like that, along those lines. But with 12th grade, though, I know that when they get to senior year, they do a lot of current events and things and how to write responses and have, argumentative essays and pick a side, things like that. So if you have a situation where there's a big topic that maybe you'd like to talk to your kid first, not a bad idea, and it keeps them current. You want them to be involved in what's going on in society. Maybe talk to them before the teacher decides, hey, we're doing an assignment on, what fill in the blank with whatever's going on in the current news. And then also, too, if you are curious, because maybe you're at a different site or a different district that isn't listed here, email your teachers. Ask them, be like, hey, I'd like to know what you guys are, what books you're offering or having my student read this coming year. Most teachers would love that because I've talked with other teachers, and we've mentioned how the involvement in parents goes from like kindergarten, where they're like over your shoulder, like always want to know what's going on, to senior year. It's like, oh, I have a kid there. I forgot about that. Like they're just not there a lot. And I get that. They get older. It's like, you're fine. Have fun. You're old enough to make your own decisions. Then we get into science. Science, we have biology, chemistry, physics, and then senior year they take some kind of anatomy or physiology. With biology, and this one always comes up, everyone's like, oh, this is like where they argue against creationism. They do teach Big Bang and evolution, but it's not that it's the right decision. They just teach it as a general term. They have so much other stuff to cover that they're not going into why, it's the right choice and why it's, how the universe did start. They're just telling you, here it is. This is what like the definition, kind of the term of it, and then they're going to move on because they have a lot to cover in biology. They're, how the body works and things like that within the body and the cells. They're not going into a full unit on, Charles Darwin and things like that. It's very brief. But still something you should talk about with because normally that's a 9th grade class with your incoming, starting high school freshmen. Because, in case their friends are like, yeah, Big Bang's, that's the truth. And they're like, and you're like, wait, my mom told me differently. And to have that conversation before it turns into, how dare you think, how you can't believe that stuff, that's totally wrong. Our teacher said this is what happened. So having those conversations with them. Then they go into chemistry, which is a lot more of just the science and the numbers and balancing equations. So there's not a lot controversial there. Same thing with physics. That's a lot more math and that one as well. Then anatomy is just the human body, physically, how it works. The bones, the ligaments, your blood, all that other stuff, the organs, everything like that. Again, not super controversial, again, because it's not talking about certain body parts, really. It's just kind of, here's the body, it's a skeleton, that kind of thing. But again, I'll keep referring back to this. If you are curious at any level, email your teacher. Be like, hey, is there anything I should be, concerned about? What, is there any controversial topics? Just ask, because most teachers don't get that. Normally the parent will come later after their kid has already learned it, and they're like, how dare you teach my kid this, that, and then it turns into a whole thing. Okay, so be proactive with that stuff. And then lastly, social studies. Your 4 main ones here you have is world history, U.S. history. I'm going to skip over the other 2 for a second. Government, economics. Those are kind of the 3 main ones, okay, that you're taking are required. World history, you're going to cover things like they're going to talk about world religions. And again, it's not this is the right answer, everyone should be Islam, or this is, it's not it. It's just, it's a big part of world history. I mean, any of you who've, looked into any of that, the history of other countries, know they're much older than our country and have had many different religions, and their whole country is based off of Islam or Buddhism or Christianity. Those are 3 they talk about. So there is no conversion. It's just, here's the basics of what they believe, and they move on. So if you, again, want to talk to your kid about that before they get into that unit, again, talk to them, sit down with them, be like, here's what Islam is, here's what Buddhism is, and you're not validating it, you're just saying this is a religion that does exist. We don't believe that in our family, but they're going to teach you about it, and so here we are. It'll also compare different governments, because obviously in our world it's not all the same. Everyone has different types of government in our world. U.S. history, that's going to go through the story of us, our country, and the growth and the ups and downs we've had, as well as the civil rights movement, talking about even like if you go further back, slavery in the South and our country's growth through that, and even covers war and death. So if that's something you haven't talked about with a student, that can be a little jarring sometimes for some students. Not, being able to see pictures of, people who have died in battle, it can be a little rough. So, embracing that beforehand can be very helpful. The other two classes that I haven't mentioned yet, but those are ethnic studies. This is a new class that starting next year in high school will be a graduation requirement. And within that class, they're going to be covering things like race, racism, bigotry, and the experiences of the diversity we have in our country. Not just the main topics that we learn in U.S., but a lot of the kind of untold stories in our country. And that's going to start, again, next year officially. Some high schools have already started kind of doing it this year just to kind of test it out and see how it works and how we can be best prepared for next year. In some districts, like in my own, they have combined some of the ethnic studies into U.S. history, where it has become, like I think in our district it's titled U.S. History, Race, and Gender, which has sparked a whole other conversation where parents have emailed like, I don't want my kid learning this, when really it's not, it doesn't cover as much as the title would assume it does. There's one unit in the very beginning that discusses kind of what I mentioned in the beginning there with race, racism, bigotry experiences, and the rest is just still U.S. history. You know, here's the Constitution, you know, the Mayflower, and continuing on through. But again, that is also, again, like I said, going to be a graduation requirement. And the other one is psychology. This one is an elective, so not every kid is going to take this or has to take this, but they do get into, in one of the topics is biopsychological domain, and that's just a really fancy word for sensations and perceptions. So it could get into kind of, you know, sexual feelings and things of what the body feels and how you're mentally stimulated and things like that. So that can come up. But again, that's an elective, so they don't have to take that. But it is an option. So if your student's like, I want to take psychology, make sure you know that that is a potential, you know, something they could get into. Then how to find out if you're like, I don't know, you know, where do I find all this stuff, because maybe you're hearing this for the first time. We have a lot of really good events that a lot of times parents don't show up to because maybe you're busy and you have your own kids to worry about. Totally understandable. But that list there that I put at the bottom, back to school night. That's except for this year, because our back to school night in our district was completely virtual. But normal years, that's the time you can get your entire list of students or teachers for your student in the same room together, rather than having to like hunt them down individually throughout campus or email them differently and get different responses. Back to school night gets them all in the same room, and you can kind of introduce yourself and be like, hi, I'm so-and-so, this is my student. And they're like, oh, you know, he or she's a great student, or he or she doesn't listen in class, you know, something like that. You start to get the real truth. Because I know some of you, your students will come home and be like, oh yeah, everything was great. And they don't tell you actually how their day was. So talking to the teacher will be unfiltered and be honest with you. Again, emailing the teachers. I know our site, and I believe our district and our USD uses Aries. All that information for your students is on Aries for the teachers, so you can get a hold of them very quickly that way. The other one too, and I know most teachers, and especially the ones in the room, use Google Classroom. It's really nice and really easy to use, and all of the assignments for the most part are posted through there, or at least syllabus or some kind of curriculum for the class is going to be on there. And that also will be a good way to, okay, what are they teaching? What's coming up? Here's what you're learning right now. I use it a lot, especially if a student is missing or absent. It's all in there. And that makes it really nice. So I don't have to worry about when they get back having this stack of papers for them. It's like, it's all in Google Classroom. Make sure you get it done in time. That's a good way to do it. And you can check due dates as well. If your student is, not telling the truth with you and is like, oh, I don't know, it's due later. And it's due tomorrow, or it's due at midnight that night, and you're like, oh my gosh, we're staying up late tonight. You can check due dates of things if it's on Google Classroom. That way you're ahead of your student, and they're not just like, oh yeah, it's whatever. It's not that they like nonchalantly push it under the rug. You're on top of it, and you know when that assignment's due, so your student doesn't fall behind. Checking Aries with grades is another one. I bug my students about this, because what'll happen is they'll forget to check their grades, and then a week later they'll come yelling at me because of an assignment they didn't turn in last week. But last week I had a B, and now I have a D. What happened? Well, just check your Aries. It says exactly, you got a 0 on the test last week. That's why you don't have a good grade. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. It's like, well, check it daily. And the same thing with you as parents. Don't wait for that 6-week progress report or the 12-week report card. Check weekly, because it's on there. It's very simple and easy to access, okay? And your students know how to do it. As much as they're going to deny you and be like, oh, I don't know what that is, they know how to use it. They'll show you, okay? And then, again, we have parent nights depending on the subject. I know math night is a big one because students do struggle with math. I was one of those students who struggle with math. Like Sam had mentioned, board meetings, that's public, that's open to the public. Anyone can go and see what's coming down the pipe. For example, that ethnic studies class, that's been talked about for the last year and a half, of where they've been going to those meetings and discussing, is this what we want to do? What is, the district superintendent saying at the state level? Like, what is it coming down kind of the pipeline? College and career, we have our district, I know other districts have this too, but we have college and career centers where they can go and talk about what's life after college for them, or excuse me, after high school. Some it's college, some it's military, trade school, some maybe just go right into working for maybe companies you own or have family or friends that own. And that's great too, but looking at what are their options. And then the last thing I'm going to mention here is talking to your kids. It's hard in the 9th through 12th grade because they think they know everything. I thought I did. And they just don't want to express their feelings in a lot of cases. Again, I didn't either. But really talk to them, like kind of pry them open a little bit and ask, like, hey, how's everything going at school? How are all your classes? How's everything with your friends? What's a class you're struggling in? How can we get you help for that class? Things like that. Ask them how they're feeling, especially this year, coming back after a year off. I have had kids come to me already in the first 5 weeks and tell me, like, I'm not adjusting well. Like, I'm used to sleeping in my bed all day and having like the comforts of home readily at my hands and like right there. And I just, the scheduling is off. I'm not eating right. Like everything, it's a struggle. Mentally, or physically, they might look okay, but mentally, a lot of our students are really struggling. Still, even though we've been back for a month, there's kids who are just now starting to piece it together. And that's, it's been 5 weeks. So talk to them, see what they're really struggling with, because that is going to be the way that they're going to open up to you and start talking to you about like what really is going on in their life. Because it sounds like they don't want to talk to you, but they really do. They're just plain hard to get. Okay. All of these resources at the bottom are all the framework for all of California. So at any point you need to know what is being taught in that grade, those links at the bottom are for science, English, and history for every grade level and the topics they're gonna cover. So if you, as a family, decide that there's something else I didn't talk about in here is controversial and you need to talk about, those resources right there will cover everything through all of high school. Okay? I think let me just double check. Yeah, that is the end of my time. Thank you so much for coming. You being here makes you a step ahead of most parents. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to send it off to amazing Mrs. Murtaugh, Lisa Murtaugh, who is awesome, and she's going to take over with development.
Thank you, Kyle Perry. Oh, can you hear me? I don't hear any feedback at all. It's like a really good speaker system or something. You can hear me? Okay. So I get to talk to you about development. Maybe I should tell you who I am a little bit first. My name is Lisa Murtaugh. I have raised 3 kids through the Grove. They all went to Poly High School. I currently teach at Poly High School. And I worked with the high school group at the Grove for 10 years, more than 10. So I've been around and watched high schools from a lot of different angles. I want to say that this resource that Sam is offering you, these pamphlets, are spot on. I looked at them and I thought I could see each of my children at the different grade levels. So I thought, oh, this is really helpful. So up on the slide, kind of the main questions. 9th grade, think of activities. This is me now. We're a new person. 10th grade, why not? You might have heard that before. 11th, just trust me. And 12th grade, what's next? Kind of for your student and for you. 12th grade, everyone's thinking about that. Physically, so this is pretty simple. And you know some of this and you might already see some of it. They have difficulty falling asleep before 11. They need 9 hours of sleep. Phones and technology are the enemy of this. You may already be fighting that. I would say keep your strong boundaries there. Puberty changes the needs for hygiene. They don't know. They don't believe you. I have actually had one of my children tell me, nobody else says I stink. So just help them understand that. They also need more exercise. Their bodies are growing, and so they need to be able to learn their new spatial relationship. And they also need to get themselves tired enough to go to sleep. So you can see the cycle, right? We're not really tired. We need more exercise. We get more smelly, right? Like all of these things kind of go together. 12th grade, you might get the added bonus of wisdom teeth. Think 2-year-old teething, but high schooler. Sometimes that comes in later. You guys know that. The biggest thing that we need to remember is that they are motivated by freedom. So if you're finding them unmotivated, figure out what they want to be free with all through high school. They just want more freedom. And the balance of privileges and responsibilities is really important. You don't want to give someone too much freedom without responsibility. So measuring that, reading up on that, learning about that, measuring that with your child is really helpful. I think we tend to take on more of a coaching level. You're still parenting, you're still setting some boundaries, but they're having to choose more now. Consequences, boundaries, structure, even contracts can be helpful. So then it's not you versus them, it's them versus the contract. They agree with it, they work on it. That worked really well with one of my children who was really fighting for independence and trying to balance that privileges with the responsibilities. The contract was a nice thing to look at. Socially, oh my goodness, guys, I did not start my little timer. That was supposed to help me. In the back, you're going to have to give me a countdown. Jackie, okay. Socially, so 9th grade, increased interest in sexual expression. They might be wearing clothes that fit their curves a little bit more, working out their muscles, looking in the mirror. Relationships are kind of short-lived. You might remember that. I date this person for a minute and then not. They might be tempted to change their appearance. I know at Poly right now, the hair color change is really popular. I see students come in, 9th grade, they look like this. 10th grade, it's almost unrecognizable. 11th grade, they go into something else. It's a way to express themselves and to figure out who am I, who do I fit in with, and to get that sense of belonging. In 10th grade, there's an increased susceptibility to date violence. That is something I would encourage you to talk about. Just bring up the topic of sex with your student. You want him to learn it from you. Make it a comfortable thing. Bring it up until they're like, Mom, Dad, nah. Just make it a topic of conversation because it needs to be there. They need to know what kind of things could happen and have boundaries in place to protect themselves. Depression is big in the 10th grade. It's big through high school because of the hormones and social engagement. Teen suicide is the highest at this level. You may know someone in your life who had committed suicide in high school. Your kids might have friends who are depressed. It is our goal, and I'm going to keep saying this throughout this, our job as believers is not to be judges. We're to be there to be loving to the people who are hurting. 11th grade, a little more committed relationships. 54% are sexually active. Let's see. What will you do if your child doesn't do what you ask them to do? Kind of having in the back of your mind, kind of being prepared for things to go this way or that way. We talked about in our group how even the most innocent child, you might think, oh, this kid never does anything wrong, might be hiding some technology between their mattress. There's things that happen there. Kids get really good at hiding things. Have questions, open conversations. Keep that relationship open at maybe not at all. Yeah, you got to keep that relationship open because you want to be there for them. Gender identity is something I just want to touch on briefly. This is really big in the high schools, in our culture. It's discussed often. Your child is likely to have a friend who has a gender identity perspective and a different way of looking at things. So keep that relationship open. Remember, we're not judging. Mentally, we want to, ninth grade, they're starting to focus better. You can see more up there. The focus would be on delighting and understanding rather than airing your own opinion. Understand them, get them to talk to you. Emotionally, ninth graders feel empowered through choices. 10th graders, give them some specific praise. 11th graders value humor. They might struggle with regulating their emotions. A lot of us do, but in high school it's even harder. When they get towards their 12th grade year, helping them decide what to do with their future, you're going to really want to have that relationship with them. I could say a lot more. The pamphlet is really good. I thought you said 1 minute for the thing. You saw me rush. I was like, oh, okay, that was 1 minute for that slide. So where was I, Jackie? Okay, thank you. On the mentally? Okay, I'm trying to be respectful, people. I thought, how did the time? Socially, 12th grade. There we go. I got 1 more minute on this slide, or I allowed it. Okay. 12th graders, they're less available for family time because they're trying to find their place in the world. It's this push away, this step away. I am my own person. So figuring out that relationship and allowing them to fly, because that's what they're supposed to do. That's what you want them to do. You want them to fly. You don't want them to be at your house when they're 30 years old, not knowing what to do with their life. So encouraging them to fly and knowing that they're going to fall. They might hurt themselves, and you might see it coming, and sometimes you can't do anything about it, but being there with that relationship, knowing that they have you and that God is connected. Yeah. High schools are hard, guys. It's really hard. Mentally. Now I can slow down on this a little bit. Have you had a child say to you, I'm bored? My parents used to tell me, then go pull weeds. So I didn't say it very much, but I felt it. It kind of can mean I don't understand. I don't understand why you're making me do this. I don't understand what you want from me or what the purpose of this is. In 10th grade, you'll start to see them push back on the adult world. So your opinion, they might just start to fight everything you say for no reason. Because it's that separation. I'm an adult, I'm different from you. And don't you want them to be a little critical of the adult world? To see things different, to have a bigger world, to open their eyes? They might teach you a few things. Mine did. All through high school, they have that feeling of everybody's. So even if they're not, they do things because they feel like they're on stage like I do right now. 11th grade, I love when my kids would say things that were insightful. That I would say something and they'd call me out on it. And it was just amazing to hear the new, fresh perspective. The long-term thinking doesn't come easily. So we can think about the things right in front of us. You've heard that the brain is not fully developed, the decision-making lobe right up here, until you're 26. Recently, I heard it's not till 30. It's new research, so we're all hurting people. So they'll take risks because they can't think long-term. Again, that's part of learning, and your job as a coach to be like, here's some possible things that could happen with that. 12th graders may overly romanticize or catastrophize. The word drama comes to mind. We didn't have that word when I was in high school, but it's a very helpful word. They still struggle with long-term planning, even though we're asking them to decide what they want to do with their life. It's okay not to know what you want to major in. It's okay not to know what you want to do with your life. How many of you changed what you wanted to do with your life after your 12th grade of high school? Right? Most of us did. Emotionally, they again feel powered through choices. I think that is really important, because when I was raising my kids, I gave them choices, but not as, it was very small. But the older they get, the more choices, the more they like it. They want intense feelings and emotions, so they're striving for that, and they get a little more focused on that as they get older. Sophomore, I learned this a long time ago. Soph is the root word for wise, and more is the root word for moron. So wise fool. So they have all this knowledge, but they don't know what to do with it yet. So it's good. They're learning things. Don't tell them they're a wise fool. That's not nice. But know in your head that they've got all the information. They're trying to put feet on it. In 12th grade, that demonstration of initiative for personal interests is really important. Anything they're a little interested in, feed it. Like, help them to know that they can do something. They can be strong, that they're good at something. Find what they're strong at and focus on that. Again, I think I just want to focus on, there's so much going on in our world and our culture. Kyle touched on it. And we want to raise arrows. The Bible talks about having your quiver full of arrows, right? We want to raise children who can be a light in a dark world. And they are in a dark world. That you can keep them covered a little bit while they're younger, but preparing them. This is something that James Dobson said in one of his books that always stuck with me. Preparation over protection. So if you can help your child step out and prepare them to be strong and to fight instead of standing in front of them, they'll have a certain skill set that they won't if you just protect them. Of course, there's some, you take that with balance. I didn't say it, Dobson did. So I think I have covered it all here. So here comes Sam. Dun, da, da.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, Kyle. That was fantastic. So we're going to wrap up today talking about, so biblically, how do we respond as parents? Let me introduce, so I'm Sam. You already met me. Let me introduce David.
My name's David. I get to serve on our high school team here at the church. Sam gave us 15 minutes, and if there's anything you don't do is you don't give pastors 15 minutes for anything. So we're going to get through a lot of information, but I'm excited to be with you this morning.
So David and I are kind of go back and forth on this, talking about biblically how do we lead our kids? How do we respond to them in light of all this? What they're being taught at school, developmentally where they are, and so we're going to go through quickly a lot of this stuff. We've got resources at the end. I encourage you to check out those resources because I think they're really, really valuable, really, really good. So first thing is understand you're still the primary spiritual leader in your kid's life. Like, first and foremost, even with your kids in high school, no matter what society says, no matter what their friends say, no matter what they say, you are still the most influential person in their life, and you are still the spiritual leader in their life. And so you model that primarily by the way you live, the way you act, the way you talk, what you do, how you not only talk about faith, but then how you live that out in front of them. That's super important, that they're seeing that faith is genuine and real for you. So if you say that church is really, really important, and then you guys don't go, that's sending this mixed message where they're hearing that, but what they see is, no, that's not important. I know I'm speaking to the choir here because y'all are here, but I think that's an important thing that we're living out. We're modeling our faith for our kids. It's important that we're staying engaged in our kids' lives. And that there's a temptation to disengage as they get older. We're just hearing they're busier. They have sports, they have activities, they have friends, they maybe have a license. They're wanting to go out and do other things. It's easy to sometimes disengage, be like, oh, well, they're taking care of themselves. They're kind of on autopilot. It's really important that we stay engaged, that we stay connected, that we know what's going on in their life, that you know who their friends are. that you know what they're doing, what are they interested in, what are they involved in, that you're continuing to talk to your kids, capitalize on those opportunities to stay connected and have meaningful conversation with them. That's a really, really important thing. Making sure that you're taking time to listen to your kids. As parents, we're really good at lecturing. Like, we're super good at lecturing, right? We can just tell them, well, here's why. Actually take time to listen and hear what's going on inside their mind. Why are they thinking this way? Why are they feeling this way? And actually taking time to actually hear them as a parent rather than just tell them, and have good dialogue. You need to have boundaries with them, but it's important that they feel heard. Every single person, that is a important value. In fact, in one of my counseling classes, it was a marriage class, but our professor said that some psychologists will actually say the need to be understood is even more powerful than the need to be loved. Like that your kids feel understood and heard is really powerful, even if you still say no. That you're actually taking time to listen. And then be intentional about one-on-one time with your kids. That this is so valuable, so important, especially if you have multiple kids. Being intentional about that one-on-one time. When I was a youth pastor, my kids were probably 3 and 5. I mean, they were little. We did a parenting your teen class. It was a big seminar, and the guy came out and spoke, and I thought it was fantastic. He said, I go every single week. I go with my kid to breakfast. 6 times out of 7, we just eat breakfast, and there's not really any great conversation. But every once in a while, he's got something going on, and because we've built this relationship, this conversation, this safe place, when he has something going on, he shares that with me, and we have a great dialogue. And so that's something that I've implemented with my kids. As they got older, we're going to go to coffee, we're going to hang out, we're going to talk, we're going to share, just creating that safe place where they can be heard. So that's important. I'm going to hand it off to David. He's going to share a little bit.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sam. As we talk about all of these things, I think a common temptation whenever we look at something, we're like, that's a really good idea. That's not even something that I maybe do well, is to look at it and to think, you know what, that's impossible. You know what, that would have been great to know years ago or a long time. And Sam's going to talk about this in a little bit. But even in this, some of these things might sound awkward that we're like encouraging you to do. It's like, wow, that would be really weird if I just went one-on-one with my kid every single week or something like that. And you know what? You're right. It might be a little weird at first because high schoolers are a little weird. They just are. But that's okay. Bear with them in the weirdness and walk with them through it, and eventually these things will become normal. I want to talk a couple minutes on prepping for college, adult life, and technology. I'm going to go over these things very briefly. We just had our planning retreat for our high school ministry. We're actually going to be doing a prepping for college and adult life class just for your students in the next few months so that as they're deciding for colleges and things like that, they can have these things in the back of their mind as well. First thing I want to talk about just right off the bat is responsibility. Transitioning to that responsibility right now, not just when they're 18. A common temptation, I think, and the thing I see with parents is like, hey, you're turning 18 soon. That means all of these things are going to hit you right at once. And for a high school kid, that's pretty overwhelming to say, like, oh my gosh, like now all of a sudden I have to worry about taxes and paying for my own gas and car insurance and laundry, right? So now is a good time while they're in high school, getting into 9th and 10th grade, to start handing over things here and there. One basic thing my parents did was with an alarm clock. They said, I'm not waking you up in the mornings anymore. Right when we were in sophomore, junior year, that was on me now to make sure I set my alarm clock. If I didn't set my alarm clock, I was going to have a rough morning. They let me experience that sometimes. Chores, starting to pay for their own gas. A big one is laundry. Moms, I know you love to help your kids out, but sometimes, or dads, it's good to make them say, hey, if you don't have clean clothes, that's on you this week. That was a hard thing for a high schooler for me to figure out, but it's really good for them too. Paying for some of the mistakes if they start driving, if they get a ticket, making them pay for their own ticket, not just saying, wow, you made a mistake, here you go, but instead saying, listen, this part of like doing these things and having these things is realizing that you have a responsibility. All these things will help them as they go into adulthood. So feeling the weight of responsibility, yes, but also experiencing the joy of responsibility. So as they get older, it's not like, hey, you have to do all these things, but you also just have to still have all the same responsibility or the freedoms that you have as a younger child, but instead giving them a little bit more leash. Let them maybe stay out an hour later. If you have a kid that's in 7th, 8th grade, they might have a curfew, or even 9th and 10th grade, they might have a curfew, but as soon as they get into 11th and 12th grade, considering them giving them an extra 30 minutes to stay out, just so that they can feel like, wow, I have more responsibility, but I also get a little bit more leash with this too. Same thing with having the car or when they're allowed to use the car. Another thing about preparing for college and adult life is being a good employee. This is a big thing. I really believe that Christians should be the model employees in the workplace. They should be the hardest working, most respectful, most hospitable people inside of whatever job that they have, whether they're working at a Christmas tree farm or whether they're working at McDonald's or Starbucks or whatever it is. They should be setting the pace. So that means being on time. I did Taekwondo growing up, and I had an instructor. His name was Master Duke. And I remember being 8 years old and showing up, and the first thing when you met him, he would be like, hey, what time is class today? And we'd be like, it's at 4 o'clock. He's like, no, class is at 3:55. He's like, if you're 5 minutes early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. And so I remember showing up on time, sometimes running into the door right when the class is starting, and him making me do push-ups or laps around the little gym. And I'd be like, why am I, it was my parents' fault. He's like, well, then find a way to get your parents on time. He's like, that's on you. So that's a big thing for students is learning, hey, I got to be on time. Being hardworking, being respectful, being someone that is reliable at their job, not just being the prototypical teenager working, but saying, hey, if you committed to a shift, you show up. It doesn't matter what's going on. You got to go and do these things. Another big one is loans. Talking with your kids about the ramification of taking out a loan. I could go on for hours on this, on student loans especially, but also with car loans. The banks, here's the thing. The banks don't care about your children. They just don't. I remember signing a variable interest rate loan that was 2.5% to 22%. By the time I graduated high school, it was at graduated college, it was at 12%, one of my student loans. They don't care. They just don't. So if you let your child just say, hey, yeah, you can sign this variable interest rate with Wells Fargo or whatever it is, it's going to hurt them. And a common temptation is like, hey, you're going to get a great job right out of college and everything's going to be great. And that might be true, but they also live in California, and the cost of living here is a lot higher than a lot of other places. So start talking with them about these things. If they don't know what they want to do right away, it's okay to go to a community college. I changed my majors 4 times in the first 2 years, and I actually did my major classes in my last 2 years, and I just got it down, found a way. I wish I'd gone to community college and saved $50,000 in doing that. But now I get to pay for that mistake. So talking to them about these things, talking to them about, hey, maybe you shouldn't go get a car loan right now at a 6% interest rate because that's all you can afford. Maybe you should try to save up and buy a car cash that's not as nice as what you want. These are really important things to start talking about now. Finances and taxes, talking about budgeting. There's a great, Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University for Teenagers is fantastic. I remember going through it when I was in high school, and it's what set me on a good path to never get a credit card. I've never used something as credit. I've never been in a place where I'm like, hey, I don't have the money for this, but I really want to anyway. I'm going to put it on a credit card. Like, that just doesn't compute in my head now because of that class. So it's a great thing. And then tithing. Your students will do what you do. So if you want to model this well, you talk about, hey, this is what we tithe. We tithe 10% off of this, and this is when we do it. And being open about those things will be a huge help for your children too. Moving into technology, this is huge. We have to do better at teaching our students boundaries with phones, tablets, and computers. I'm of the firm belief that your student in 9th to 12th grade should never have a computer in their home, in their room, In their home, obviously, that's just a part of life, but inside of their room, by themselves, there's just not a time for it. If they're doing school and they need to be doing homework, they should be with you in the living room. Their screen should never be allowed to be turned away when a parent is looking at. Like, there's temptation everywhere. Pornography is a huge thing for students. It is more rare for me to meet a student who hasn't looked at pornography than there is for a student that has looked at pornography now. And that's including with guys and the girls inside of our groups. And so just be aware of that. Like, that's going to be a thing. If you catch your student looking at pornography, there's a big temptation to say, what are you doing? I can't believe this is going on, and to really beat up on them. And part of it is realizing, like, hey, you made a mistake. There's sin there. You have to work with them in that. But they also need a good teammate. Your student's not going to conquer this temptation to not look at pornography in high school by themselves and working in a silo. And I can't just do it as their pastor, or their leaders can't just do it as their group leaders, or whatever that is. They need your help too. They need you to realize, like, hey, that they need to realize that you're on their side in that fight and in that battle, that you want success for them, that you want them to see, you want to see them thrive even in a world of temptation. And so make sure you know that if you have a student that struggles with that and you've caught them in that, whatever it is, man, let them know, like, hey, you made a mistake. There might be some consequences for this, but also let them know, like, hey, I'm here for you. Start checking up on them weekly, saying, hey, what's going on? How was this last week? Did you make any mistakes? Do we need to talk about anything? That's what they need more than a parent that just goes, hey, you're grounded for 2 months, I'm taking your phone away. That won't make the pornography issue go away. They need someone that's going to be an advocate with them. Teaching your kids discipline about healthy boundaries with it. There's a great book called Tech-Wise Families, and it has a lot of really great resources I'd encourage you to read. It's really short. It's my kind of book. It's 80 pages, and they're like this big. So definitely pick that up. It's in our bookstore. Another great resource for you, and if you have time this afternoon, maybe between the afternoon football games and Sunday night football, I would go watch something called The Social Dilemma. It's on Netflix. I believe it's PG-13. I think there's some language in it, but it's all trying to help you understand what social media is doing to your child. It's phenomenal. They talk about, I'll just give away one thing. They talk about inside of high school, how it's one of the most difficult times for their hormones and whatever it is that's going on inside their mind. It's stressful. Whether you remember it or not, it's a stressful time for these 9th to 12th graders. And so with that, we have to one of the things they point out is what dopamine does inside of looking at social media whenever they get an alert of a text message. It's giving them a hit of dopamine in the same way that alcohol does it, or in the same way of a cigarette and nicotine would do that too. And they say, like, hey, you wouldn't ever go to your 14-year-old kid who's having a stressful day and open up the liquor cabinet and say, hey, have a glass of whiskey. Like, I know you're having a rough day. But in a way, you actually do that with the technology that's inside of their pockets. I believe that technology is not all bad, but it needs to have boundaries. So that's something that you should help with them, but then also you yourself should model with them. And so if you have a student that's like, if you're telling your kid, like, hey, you only get an hour on your phone, but then you spend 2 hours every night on the couch next to them while they're not on their phone, but you are going through social media, going through Facebook, they're going to look at that and say, wait, double standard. What's going on here? So wait, that means when I'm an adult, I can just do this? Like, well, no, wait a second. You should walk through these things with your students too. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam, and he's going to talk a little bit about gender, sexuality, and dating.
Thanks, David. All right, well, we are, right now, I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning. If you have any questions, we're going to do a Q&A time afterward. There's in 2 minutes, we're going to come pick those up in the center aisle if you have a question. If not, that's okay, but we'll do that, pick those up in a couple minutes. All right, so gender, sexuality, dating. I think it's really, really important that we are talking to our kids about gender, about sexuality. And hopefully by this point, you've already had a conversation with your kids about sex. If not, you're like way, way, way behind in that. So have that conversation. But I think it's important, if we're not talking to our kids about on gender, a biblical perspective on sexuality, who's going to talk to them about that? That's our responsibility as parents. And so they're going to hear different competing perspectives from society, even from friends, from school, from TV. And it's important that we're grounding them in a biblical perspective of gender, biblical perspective of sexuality. And so there's some verses there, and you guys can kind of look at, but it's important that our kids understand that we are creating God's image. We're created male and female. That is God's design. That is God's design. That is His intent. That is the way He has created us. And I think it's important that our kids understand that God's design is that we're created male, we're created female. It's important that our kids understand that marriage, God's design of marriage, is one man and one woman. We see that in Genesis 2. Jesus reaffirms that. It's important that our kids understand that. It's important that our kids understand that when we walk away from God's standard, when we walk away from God's design, that there's consequences. And even Romans chapter 1 talks about this, that as a society, when we step away from God's design for sex, God kind of says, okay, well, go ahead and do what you want. And we've seen that in our own world in the last 60 years with the sexual revolution and kind of a gradual and slow change. There's a change away from a biblical perspective of sexuality and biblical perspective of gender. And so it's important that we're having those conversations with our kids. I think it's also really important at the same time that we are asking our kids, like, what do you think? What do you hear? What's going on in your mind? Because sometimes we assume, well, our kids, because I've told them a biblical perspective of sexuality, well, of course, that's the standard that they still hold on to. It's important that you kind of hear and ask, what are you thinking? What are you hearing? What's going on in your mind? What's going on in your friends? What's going on in those conversations? And actually letting them speak into that as well. And be able to point them to, well, here's what God's standard is. But it's important that we listen and we hear what's going on with them. I think it's important also, and I think Lisa talked about this, it's important that we give our kids a biblical standard and that we also help them understand a biblical standard of loving and caring and having compassion for others. It's important that our kids understand what it looks like to love others who are different than them, whether that's any sort, but especially even, with, as we're talking about sex, we're talking about gender, people who have a different perspective, can we love them? Can we befriend them? Can we care for them? And it's important as parents, we're modeling our faith for them. Do our kids see that in us? Are we loving and compassionate and caring toward people who have a different perspective than we do? I think it's a really, really valuable, important thing for us to be able to do. In fact, there's one of our podcasts, one of our resources, Sean McDowell, if you know him, he did an interview on a parenting podcast and talking about gender and how do we have conversations with our kids if they are experiencing gender dysphoria or maybe experiencing transgender sort of feelings, or what about if their friends are? How do we have those conversations? I thought it was really, really good, well worth a listen. I know one of the things that even Stacy and I, my wife and I, we have, after our girls are now in college, but one of the things I think that we're proud of with our girls is, they had friends in high school who were homosexual, who were transgender, and we continue to have a conversation with them about that. Like, okay, what do we believe? What's God's? And so for them saying, yeah, no, we understand God's standard. At the same time, these are my friends. I'm going to love them. I have compassion for them. I'm going to care for them. And I think it's important that we can say, okay, can we love people who have a different value and different perspective than us? I think that's an important thing for us to be able to balance as parents. It's important that we talk to our kids about dating, about relationships, about what are the expectations, who can they date, like when can they date? Do you have that? Do they have an understanding of when's the right time? Is there an age? What are their expectations when they date? Like, do they need to come and talk to me? We told our girls, hey, when you're going to date someone, they have to come talk to your dad. They have to come talk to me, and they have to. That's part of the deal. What about like boundaries? Have you talked about boundaries in sexuality and in dating? What are those boundaries? And just having those conversations, I think it's important that we we continue to have that conversation with our kids. It's really important. So talking about this idea of playing the long game, David and I were talking about this idea of as parenting, it's important that we play the long game, even when our kids are in high school. There's a temptation, especially our kids get closer to graduating, like, oh no, I've got to get all this stuff in by the time they're 18. And maybe I feel like I didn't get all that in when they were younger. And now I've got this pressure to squish all this parenting into a year and a half, and we can overload them. And I think it's important to understand you are going to be parenting your child till they're 50 years old. Like, you don't stop parenting when they turn 19 or when they move out of the house. Your parenting relationship certainly looks different, but you continue to parent them. And so I think it's important that you play the long game rather than saying, I've got to overload them with information and content and get everything in that I missed in the first 16 years and now shove it all in on the back end. That's overwhelming for a student. That's overwhelming for you. And so it's important that we play the long game and think, okay, I'm going to be their parent for a really long time. I'm going to be their parent till probably they turn around and now they're taking care of me at whatever age that is. But I'm still pouring into their life and leading them and guiding them. And so we get to model a lot of these things for our kids. We get to model forgiveness and confession. And especially if you feel like I've missed things, I haven't done parenting well for the first 15, 16 years. Maybe there are things that I missed, things I would have done differently. You know what? That's a great opportunity to model confession and to say, you know what? I missed it on this. I should have been a little more proactive, and I'm sorry that I wasn't. What a beautiful thing for your kids to experience. You are a sinful person, and they are a sinful person. You're a sinful person saved by the grace of God. I get to share that with my kids, and they get to see, what is confession? What does that look like? What does forgiveness look like? And you're modeling that for them. And understand this, it's never too late to start. It's never too late to start. If you're like, maybe I'm a brand new believer, I'm a brand new Christian, I have not led my kids in a Christian, in a Christian belief, it's never too late to start. You start today. I heard Daniel Bishop's dad, he shared, he said, there was a Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. I'm like, that's great, right? It would have been great if you were, 18 years ago you were doing that, but you know what? It's never too late to start and begin whatever those, even if it's something like, we talked about this idea, Dave was talking about the idea of even technology. Maybe there's some boundaries to implement. You're like, man, I need to implement some boundaries. It's never too late to start. It sure is a lot harder when they're 16 and they've had a phone for 5 years. But, it's never too late to start. It's important we choose our battles wisely. Stacy and my wife and I used to talk about this idea that, man, we could be correcting our kids all day long if we wanted. And that's just not helpful for anyone. And so being able to say, okay, I need to choose my battles wisely. And the last thing is give yourself some grace. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to be imperfect. Give yourself some grace in that. Give your kids grace. And David's going to wrap up, and then we're going to do, we're going to collect the Q&A questions. If you have Q&A, pass them in the middle, and Stacy Boone will collect me if you have a Q&A. David's going to wrap up.
For sure, I'll keep it brief. Next one is how to have healthy conflict. There's four great verse references for you. I mean, it comes down to this, is teaching your children to understand that every single person bears the image of God. Whether they disagree with you, whether they're a different religion, whether they identify as a different sexual orientation, whatever it is, helping them realize that they still were made in the image of God and thus are deserving to be treated as such. That's not always easy to do, especially in our culture. If you open up the news and you hear and you see the worst of people at times, it could make you just want to just go off on that person. But your students are watching all of those things. So teach your child to treat everyone as they're made in the image of God. Model the Good Samaritan, how Jesus interacted with someone that was different. Pursue people that are different than you. Again, these are things that you can do, and then your student's going to see that you doing that, and they might not do it immediately, but years down the road, you might plant a seed that helped them realize, like, wow, my parents were always going after people that didn't believe the same things that we believed because they wanted them to know about Jesus. James 1:19, Ephesians 4:15, teaching your students how to disagree with people is so big. Your student will not agree with every single person, just as you don't agree with every single person. But how you handle these things, your students are still sponges. Even if they don't admit it, even if they don't always model it, they are taking in everything that you're doing and how you are acting. So to do that well, and your students are going to benefit from it. Last thing I want to cover is teaching them to view the world through the lens of Christ. Now, this is a huge one. Oftentimes in our culture, your students are taught to view the world however they want. They say, hey, whatever you think is truth, that's truth. Just go ahead and live it. And that's what they're going to be told by the media, by the social media, whatever it is, YouTube influencers, that, hey, you just do you and you're going to be just fine. Well, that was a social experiment that started like 40 years ago, and it hasn't worked, okay? It just hasn't. It was a theory of a secularization. It's not working. And so helping your students realize that there is a Christian worldview. God does want to speak into every single thing that's going on inside of this world. It's still important for them and for yourself to understand what's going on and why other people would view things the way that they view it. So don't just say, hey, this is the Christian way and this is all we do. Don't even care about anything else. Because that's not very helpful either as they interact with people in the workforce, interact with people at their schools who do think differently than them. Let them understand those things, but still help them always come back to what God says. Support your child and let them know they are loved, not shamed, even when they mess up. You have these moments every single day where you look at what something your child does and you're like, why in the world did you just do that? And you just kind of like are sitting there shocked. Like, I cannot believe they would do that. In those moments, I do this with your students in high school group too. Sometimes I'm like, why would you say that? I would never have said that. And I was talking to some of our leaders, like KP, who was a leader when I was in high school, or Lisa, who was a leader when I was in high school. And they've graciously at times reminded me, was like, David, you did do that when you were in high school. And I'm just like, dang it, you're right. So in those moments of extreme frustration with your students, try to take a couple steps back. Maybe you need to take a break and say, hey, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. Try to remember what it was like being 15, 18, where you stop caring so much about what your parents think and care more about what others think. And try to remember what it was like to go through some of the things that they're going through today. Try to empathize with them when they don't know how to handle some of their emotions, especially after being away from other people in this last year after a worldwide pandemic. There's a lot that has happened with your students, so give them grace and give yourself some grace too. But help them try, at the end of the day, view things as God would want them to view them. Parents, you're doing a great job. Wherever you're at, keep going in it. If there's some things you need to do better, my parents would go to parenting conferences sometimes, and they'll come back and be like, all right, everything's changing. And it's like, as a kid, it's like, what? Stop. Like, slow down. Like, this is my whole life you're uprooting. That's the temptation. Pick one thing, maybe just one thing, and say, hey, for the next month, we're going to focus on this. Maybe it's just the computers out of the home. Don't go into the rooms and just rip their computers up and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Here's why. And I promise in 10 years, if you can't see it yet, you're gonna thank me for this. And just pick one thing each month and keep growing and improving, and you're going to get it. Your students are going to be blessed to have you as parents that want to see them come to know the Lord. So at that, I'll hand it back over to Sam, and we'll get after the rest of the morning.
Thank you, David. We're going to do a quick Q&A. Service is going a little bit long this weekend. So we're going to do a quick Q&A, and so we'll just have everyone come back up. We'll have a quick conversation. I think we have a few questions, just a couple. Okay. Let me say this while Stacy's coming up. Oh, there's one more, Stacy. So quick thing. Let me just say this. If you guys have anything that comes up, or any questions or any concerns or something with your family, please feel free to reach out to us. I know I would love to sit down and talk with you. I know Dave would love to sit down and talk with you guys. And so, yeah, that's fine. So we would love to be a support to you guys, not just for this class, but we'd love to be a support to you ongoing. So if there's any way we can do that, we'd love to do so. I'm going to let everyone do their question. We'll do a quick Q&A, and then we'll be done in a few minutes. So thank you all for being here.
This is a very good question, and it's appropriate for me because I was in the high school group. The question is it normal for parents to stick around with a group of high schoolers? No, it's not. I would have to say that the high school group was big enough that my kids were not in my small group, and I usually discipled and mentored people who were not my kids' friends. Does that make sense? So I might have gone on an outreach trek, but they weren't in my group ever. So I was around, and I got permission from them too. One of my, I can't remember, probably my oldest. One of them didn't really appreciate that I was there too much. No, it wasn't him. I don't know. So I backed off a little bit more, and I wouldn't go to certain events. They were like, oh, could you not go to the beach trip this time? Like, that's fine. I'll not go to the beach trip. So it kept an open communication. I was around a little bit, but I didn't invade what they did in that space, if that makes sense. So it was definitely a tightrope, probably. Good question.
All right. This person's asking, what are the sources used in teaching ethnic studies, the authors that are cited in works? I don't have that off the top of my head. I've actually not personally taught that class, but I know that between the very bottom in the pamphlet where it says resources, the history standards 9 through 12, that's going to give you kind of a rundown of that. And then even from there, I think if you go on Google and type in California curriculum ethnic studies, you'll get an even more detailed look at that. And even that's going to vary to teacher, because we get from the state of California, they give us our standards, and we teach to that as best we can. And some teachers will teach it a little differently. Some might highlight one author over another. Some might talk more on one group of ethnicity versus another, and different races and things like that. So it just varied teacher to teacher. But I would reach out to, again, that teacher, whoever your student's going to have next year, and ask them specifically, hey, what are you talking about this year? What is in the articles that be expected, or my student be expected to know? So maybe you can read that article, or you read the quotes, or things or books that are by those people. So again, that's the best thing I can tell you, specifically because it's such a new class as well.
I just know from my kids going through high school, the way they would touch on ethnicity was mostly biographies. So it was just kind of true stories to kind of make their world a little bit bigger for different kids. So a lot of it was, it just shows up in a way of, let's look at it from this angle, and let's look at it from this angle, is more what I saw.
Yeah, and even in that, as you get those resources, that's good for you to go and read through those too. Read alongside with your students so you can have that dialogue. If you're worried about maybe them being taught something that doesn't agree with what Scripture says, that's a great opportunity for you to go through those sources and say, hey, yeah, I know what you're talking about. If they say, Mom, Dad, you don't know what I'm talking about. You're not in my classroom. Well, actually, I read every single resource you've read with this, and it'll give you opportunity to speak in that too. The title of the book for Boundaries is called The Tech Wise Family. I will warn you, the guys, their family does a great job with it, and it seems one of those things I'm like, wow, that might be the goal. That might be something you're uncomfortable with right away. But it has a lot of great steps to get your students and your whole family in a place where you respect technology and use it for its benefits, but you don't let it become your downfall. Yes.
And I think on that, the book is a little bit overwhelming. If you don't have many boundaries, you're like, oh, my word. And I would say just what David said earlier is, if you're going to read that book, maybe there's one thing that you're going to implement, rather than, hey, we're implementing this whole thing and no one gets a phone ever or whatever. But yeah, pick one thing and work on that.
For sure. I mean, one example of it was the phones, and there's no phones at the dinner table. So moms, dads, students, children, whatever it is, everybody puts their phone away in another room for dinner, and that's 1 hour every single day while you're doing those dishes where there's no technology. We do that with our high school services, just so you know. We're trying to get better at it every single service. We have our overflow culture is that we're engaged, and so we're trying to teach students healthy boundaries with technology by giving them an hour and a half twice a week where they don't get to use their phone. And they don't have to use their phone. So we've got Bibles, we've got journals, and things that they can use with that. So we're in it with you, and we're trying to help your students as well. One is, my daughter is addicted to her phone. We set boundaries, but she doesn't seem to be learning responsibility with it. Suggestions. It's a great question. I would start with, a great resource is the Tech Wise Family. Your student, if they feel like it's just, oh, mom and dad just hate phones or whatever it is, they might start just doing these things out of rebellion too. But, phone addiction, it is a very real thing. So start by reading the Tech Wise Family, and then start with going, and I would really encourage you to watch The Social Dilemma. And then even maybe sitting down with your child and saying, hey, without a phone, when I watched the documentary, I was on my phone just kind of scrolling through some things. And then within 5 minutes, I heard something. I was like, wait a second, that's me. They're talking about me. I got to put my phone away. Wait a second. I can't even focus on a documentary for an hour and a half without being on my phone. A lot of those things will be helpful if you go at it as a parent of just saying, this is going to kill you. This is going to, your students, again, that rebellious phase inside of them is just going to start coming up, and they're not even going to hear what you say. So try to do it in a way that will take down as many boundaries and walls that your students are already putting up. But I'd be more than happy to talk with you personally with this, and I'd love to hear how you're handling this as well with your students that are addicted to technology.
I jump in on that? There are also some really awesome apps and different strategies, not even apps, but settings within your student's phone. I'm speaking from someone who has an iPhone. I know most people do, but through that, there's a lot of things where you can limit certain app usage and even set time limits where you can, give them freedoms and be, okay, you have this certain amount, go for it. But then that way it there's nothing, you're not being essentially like a tyrant where you're taking the phone, but you're just saying you get a certain amount a day and giving them a little bit of freedom and trusting them with it. And then, like we talked about earlier with the curfews, even as they get older and saying, okay, well, hey, you've been really great and you've used this properly. Here's an extra 30 minutes or an extra hour, whatever it is, like of this specific app or, social media or whatever it might be. But there's some great stuff for that.
Yeah, with that, for you students who have iPhones, it has a lot of different things. Your student, if they're having struggles with it, they'll find ways to get around it, but it does teach them good boundaries. Another thing with computers inside the bedrooms, their phones shouldn't be inside the bedrooms either. And this is something my parents implemented later, where they just had we had charging cables outside the doors. And so there was never a taking of a phone inside of a bedroom. They would charge outside, they would charge downstairs. I, as an adult man, I don't bring my cell phone into the bedroom. I let it charge in the living room because it's just like I don't need that. I just don't. I'm a 26-year-old pastor. I'm not letting the enemy in on that area. I'm just not going to do it. And so that's another great thing. And then last note, and then I'll turn this over to Sam, is on specifically, I know that you can do it on iPhone. I think they can do it on Android too. You should just not let your student have a general internet browser on their phone. Like, they don't need Safari or Google on their phone. Like, it's just too much of a we're all in high school. The curiosity just runs rampant, and that's all part of that developmental stage. But we don't need to give them the ability to look at anything in the entire world right at their fingertips at all times. Again, that's a good thing to have structured inside of a home where it's like, hey, here's the computers, or the computers are at the dining room table during work time. They're taken away at a certain time, whatever it is, just to help your student with those boundaries too.
That's great. Great questions. Thank you guys for coming today. We really appreciate it. Whatever support that we can be to you guys as parents, we'd love to. So thank you for coming. Thanks for our team doing a great job presenting. And have a great afternoon. So thank you all so much.